start to kind of set the stage of where we're at right now with media and government. Let's hear this. We can't hear this. Okay.
We can play the different parts.
Yeah, I'll
You be Trump.
Okay, Cecilia Vega, ABC. Wait, we gotta back up a little. All right,
We watched this so many
yes, we
times.
watched. So this is our former colleague Cecilia Vega, who used to work at the Chronicle, covering Gavin Newsom. Posed a lot of questions to him he didn't like. And President Trump, surrounded by men, I'll note, basically making fun of her for the fact that he called on her and she was a little surprised, I think. And I think that moment, which kind of went viral, sums up a lot of where we're at these days.
Well, he said to her, she's surprised I called on her. And she said, excuse me? And he said, that's okay, you're not thinking, you never do. And if any of you have met Cecilia, like, thinking is what that woman does all the time. And it was, I mean, you're right, it is an example of just the level of disrespect that we're seeing from politicians.
Here we go. I think we got it. Sorry, guys.
She's shocked that I picked her.
No.
I'm going to say you're shocked.
I'm not thinking this.
That's okay, I know you're not thinking. You never do.
I'm sorry?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, it was a quick interaction. I think it tells us a lot about our president's view of the media. But I kind of want to open, Audrey, with asking you, like, if you think you're in a moment, because it's never been easy to be a member of the media and pose questions to people in power. But watching that, knowing Cecilia, I mean, what did that say to you when you first saw it?
Well, I mean, we were texting about this yesterday, and I think it's really easy for us to think that this is a Washington-only problem. You know, the president was elected president basically on the fact that he would call out what he says is a fake and dishonest media. But anyone who thinks that that is limited to the right or limited to Washington has not been paying attention to even what's happening here in San Francisco and in California. And I just really think the success the president has had in basically killing the messenger and how effective that has been for his base. We're seeing the same thing in the left in San Francisco and in the right in this country, everywhere. I mean, we're a little, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I feel like we're a little protected by this because, you know, journalists were always like on the who do you trust level. We were down there with like trial lawyers and
Car salesmen.
And now we're like slightly above the car salesman, which yay us. But I've never in my career, except for the last 2 years, had anyone in the community say to me like, how are you doing? I'm like, I'm doing great, because nobody ever asked me that before. So I think there's some good and there's some bad to it.
Yeah, well, I want to get at this issue though, because I think that there's kind of two camps I would explain, which is the sort of historical, tense relationship between the press and the people in power that they are posing questions to and, you know, trying to, I would argue, hold accountable. And then what we're seeing now, which is this idea of like fake news and what is almost a dog whistle. I mean, sometimes it's become more overt. Is one of those more dangerous than the other, do you think? Because I think you're right. I was going to ask you later on, but we can do it now. I think you have a really amazing story about getting yelled at by a governor when you were a cover reporter.
Yeah, great days. Great days, and I did not get along very well. I was 21, and I had just been hired at the Associated Press in Sacramento, and I thought, like, any day now they were going to see my genius, and I'd be elevated to the White House, and like, it was just it just happened, because obviously I was a genius. And what I was really doing was working the like 5 a.m. broadcast shift at the AP and driving from Dublin to Sacramento to be there at 5 a.m. But still, I was like, it was going to happen one day. And I got And I was doing a story about how Gray had taken, I reported that he had taken a $40,000 campaign donation and then 2 days later did something that benefited this firm of lawyers. And he called my boss and demanded that they fire me because actually it was only a $20,000 campaign donation. Which, if you think about it for a second, is actually worse, but like, so
I could be bought up for far less than what you was.
Don't ruin my reputation. But like for 2 weeks, every time Gray came out of the governor's office and saw a television camera, he would call me out by name and demand that I get fired. And it was very, like, I thought my career was over. It was never going to happen. Like, if now luckily there's far more worse things written about me on the interwebs. But if you go that far, now you might find one of these great news stories. And to me, it really crystallized the importance of, like, when we publish something, like the story that Leslie was about my bathroom Brett Kavanaugh dream, like, it is such a fear of journalists to get something wrong now, and like, I'm particularly paranoid about it. So when the politicians play on this, it's kind of like going after your biggest insecurity yourself, too, I think.
Well, right, and then our currency is our relationships and the trust that we build, right? Both like on an individual level with people that we cover who, the good ones, I would say, no matter what side of the aisle they're on, understand that our job is to hold them accountable and to ask questions, but like this isn't a personal attack, or it shouldn't be. And then more broadly, with our audience and our readers and our viewers, that is how, you know, they will come to trust us. So I want to get to that for a second, but I also want to go through some of the things that I think, you know, we hear a lot about this idea of fake news and the attacks from our president. And the way that that's actually playing out, and I should say what I have behind me is a 38-page magazine that Devin Nunes, the congressman from the Central Valley, created and sent out to voters. It's a glossy magazine. He must have spent, I guess the campaign reports come out tomorrow, so we'll know exactly how much, but I'm assuming millions of dollars, or at least $1 million, to send this out to voters. He's not attacking his Democratic opponent, who has raised $7.15 million in the Central Valley for a race that is probably going to go Nunes' way anyway. So, like, it's sort of interesting. Like, that in itself is interesting. But he's attacking the Bee, who until this year has endorsed him every time, and he doesn't like some questions that they asked. And so, I think this is a really like visceral example. But of course, so was the terrible shooting of the Capitol Gazette. And the threats that we've had called into newsrooms across the nation in recent years. And this is what Audrey tweeted: for anyone out there in the Twitter sphere who isn't a journalist, every newsroom I know, regardless of size or geographical area, has at least a handful of people who regularly harass this journalist. Everyone. And then you went on to write that it's always been a fact of newsroom life, but it's worsened. And then your other point, which is people are also backing us up, so that's nice. But how are you talking to your newsroom about this stuff? Because I think that, like, it's always been, right, there's this sort of broader threat to your career when somebody powerful calls you out by name, but then there's, like, the actual physical violence that we're seeing. And I think to Audrey's point about, you know, this being an equal opportunity across political, one thing I was looking for, and I didn't find a good one, so I'm not going to play it, but one thing we've seen in the Bay Area a lot during protests is protesters on the far left attacking journalists and stealing their cameras and inviting journalists to these protests and then telling us that they don't want us to cover it, which is...
Or saying which questions we can ask of them. Yeah, I mean, I in some ways, I'm more afraid of the far left and not as far left's response to it than the right. I mean, I think we have just come to accept that there are Fox News people and they're going to be the Fox News people. But this last mayoral election in particular, like, social media is just the worst. I mean, we should talk about social media because it really has just degenerated social discourse to a horrible extent. But the attacks that I was getting on Twitter and through email during the mayoral election here was coming from the far left, and it forced me to drastically increase my home security. Like, my phone's buzzing all the time because, like, there are cameras all over my house now. And I mean, it gets scary to the point where our newsroom, we've had to undergo active shooter situations. Now we have an annual thing where the security team comes in and they tell us how to do active shooter drills, and it's just like we have probably 5 reporters that we've had to increase their personal security at their house. So it's getting a lot, it's easier to make a threat, it's easier for them to be scary.
Right, and that's scary too because it's harder to like separate the wheat from the chaff, I feel like. Like 10 years ago at the Chronicle, remember that one dude who was always like harassing Carla Marinucci and a couple of the other female reporters, and he would send these crazy letters. And it was one person, and now online it just feels like it's so
Like
much.
so many.
Yeah, and you really don't know who to take seriously.
Yeah, I mean, it's even like, there's even a mom in my kid's class that like, when after we started doing it on social media, I'm like, oh my God, it's even happening at children's day school. I can't get away from it anymore. It's really, yeah, it's really bad. But you know, the Demonunious thing, the thing that just like, if you already subscribe to the Chronicle and you already are a member of KQED, those are priorities 1 and 2. Like, give to, like, it's $40 to subscribe to the President of E, because what they are doing down there without the attention of like national media is really amazing. Like, they are holding Nunez to task for his Russian votes, for the fact that he calls himself a farmer and he's really not, for the fact that he's going to Russia to try to find secret dirt on people. They're really holding him, I think, accountable in a way a newsroom should. And they did a profile of him that was just really remarkable. And 8 former and current congressmen in the Central Valley refused to talk to them before this. 8! I mean, even Richard Pombo, who's nobody, if you would think he'd want to be back in the news again, like, who's heard of Richard Pombo for the last couple of years? But none of them would talk to him. And it's just this slow degeneration of trying to get people to not trust in our institutions, which I think, you know, I think, frankly, the Bay Area has a huge role to play, had a huge role to play in the distrust of our institutions, because we have celebrated the idea of disruption so that you're not cool unless you're a disruptor anymore. And disruption is inherently going at the heart of our institutions. And when nobody trusts the institutions anymore, then who else are you going to trust? And without media having both trust and scale, we can't hold the powerful to account just through basic reporting, but we also don't have the megaphone for people to hear us. The number of, now I'm on my soapbox, sorry. We have a lot of problems before we got here. We have editorial board meetings where we pull in our editorial board incidentally does not report to me. They do opinion journalism, they report directly to the publisher. They do endorsements of races. The newsroom does not get a say in those. However, in the meetings where they're deciding who to endorse, they do invite the newsroom in because the reporters who have expertise have good questions. It's a chance to get people who might make news. So we invite the journalists, non-opinion journalists, to our ed board meetings. And the number of people running for BART board who have never read a story about BART and what is going on at BART, and their lack of transparency, and their lack of cleanliness, and their lack of safety, and the fact that they're trying to cover up their crime stats, and that they have fake cameras in it, like, you would be shocked at the people who are, it makes you fear for representative democracy, I will be totally honest. And that's just a lack of interest in media, I think, and in what's going on in your community.
So I want to turn the mirror back on us a little bit though too, and talk about what we can do to help this. I thought it was actually really appropriate that Leslie started with a quote from that Supreme Court decision, because I watched the Post on my way back from Chicago last weekend, and I had this moment, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but this is of course the court battle over the Pentagon Papers that started with the New York Times and the Post, and then kind of domino effect with basically most major news outlets kind of joined that case, and you had, I think, what was a 6-3 decision upholding the right of the press to publish these papers even when the administration was fighting against it. And it made me think, like, if we had that case today, what would happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certain publications that would still push it, but there are...
Oh, I'm worried about what the Supreme Court would decide.
Oh, the Supreme Court decided it. Oh, that's a good question. Maybe not this one.
Yeah, so we'll just let that. Nice thought out there. But it made me think about, what we can do. And I think one thing everybody heard about, of course, was that anonymous op-ed that the New York Times ran a couple weeks ago from a senior administration official. And it got to, thinking about how little people understand about what Audrey just explained, for example, how the editorial process actually works at the Chronicle, what it means to have an anonymous source, right? This idea that they're not anonymous to me if I'm quoting them, but they are anonymous, obviously, to the reader, and that there's an inherent amount of trust that goes along with assuming that you're going to believe what the person I'm quoting, has something valid to say. So I guess to start, I'm just curious, what you thought about that anonymous op-ed as an editor, putting yourself in the shoe. If they had come to you, if you were the New York Times person or editor, what would you have done?
I have to say, I would likely err on the side of not publishing it. I don't know who the source was, so maybe if it's John Kelly, that might change your decision making there. But if it was Nikki Haley, I don't know. I have a really hard time because they were very, very opaque, I thought, about how this came to be and who the person is and how connected they were. So, and I don't know how you do that without just making it seem like you're, I don't know. I mean, I would say our Lois, our deputy editorial page editor, and John both said they would run it. So I think there's good debates all around to be had. We have, as you know, an anonymous source policy that's 5 pages long. And it was largely written, I think, back when the Chronicle was doing the Barry Bonds investigations and when two of our reporters, this is when Marisa and I both started working there, we were babies at the time, so we barely remember, but they had an anonymous source that was giving them grand jury testimony and or transcripts. And so out of that, we have this 5-page policy on when you use them and when you don't. I think the issue of trust and how we get news is so, I didn't even realize how people don't understand what it is we do. So every other Tuesday in the newsroom, I give a tour of the newsroom to subscribers, about 40 at a time. So I've probably now gone through probably 2,000 people. And every single person who comes in thinks I read everything before it's published. Which, yeah, Marisa's you don't read anything.
No, that's not true. Actually, if Audrey's reading it, you're it's going to be a hard edit.
It's not going to be good for me.
I mean, just because the structure of these organizations is that you can't possibly have one person funneling through all the content. I mean, it's just not realistic. She would never sleep or do anything else, or see her child, or talk to you guys.
Which I already don't do very much anyway. But this idea that the other thing that I think is hilarious about how people assume the media works is that I can have an idea for a story and then tell a reporter to do it, which if you've ever tried, if you've never met a journalist before, they have no respect for authority and question everything. So as an employee base to manage, it's sort of the worst of all the world. So,
and that's their job, right? I mean, if they're not questioning Audrey, how are they going to question the governor?
Right, that's exactly true. But the idea that I can have a conspiracy theory that I want them to write about, and then they would just do it. It's the most. I wish it was that easy to get a reporter to write a story. It's not at all. It's a much more collaborative thing than that. But I think as an industry, we've done a really crappy job of explaining how do we get news, where does it come from, why are 3. Did you know that a decent story needs 3 sources to it? And those sorts of things we just have taken for granted that people know. So we have our ethics statements and our policies that are public facing. We have our corrections policy that's public facing. We try to talk about it a lot. But I think, you're all busy, right? And it's really easy to get news in the world. So the idea that you would sit down with the newspaper and then feel contented is an increasingly diminishing idea in our democracy. So we need to do an even better job of explaining what's legit, explaining what's not legit. Oftentimes we don't like to do that. And to get it to you in a way that is easy and friction-free, and that you want to read.
Yeah, and this is less of a question. I have 2 tweets up here. So this is one from, I think she's a Wall Street Journal reporter. Allison, sorry. And this gets to Leslie's little thing about her Kavanaugh dream, where like the worst part of this dream was that she thought she had some typos in a story. Like that is what keeps me up at night, is when I go to bed on a big story and go, oh my gosh, could that have been, a 0.1 versus a 0.2? I mean, it really does, like, again, this is our currency, and so I think that it's, that's one of the most sort of disheartening thing about this narrative about KQED News. I don't even want to say it that much because I feel like it perpetuates this idea. And then the other issue is sort of what goes into a story that has nothing to do with who you quote in it, but it's like that institutional knowledge. And I think that that's one thing we've seen disappearing more and more, especially as KQED and the Chronicle are probably going to be fine. The Fresno Bee, the Marin IJ, these smaller papers or smaller public media stations. I mean, fun fact that I didn't know until I came to public media. You know how every time we get a Republican Congress, they threaten to take away NPR funding? The reason that doesn't actually go anywhere is that KQED does not depend on federal funding to do what we do. We have foundations and individuals and members and donors that help us. The Chronicle has a subscription base because we're in the wealthy Bay Area that hasn't always been enough, but is way better than what the Fresno Bee is depending on. So it ends up being these small, the Kentucky public media going to their usually Republican congressperson and saying, hey, if you do this, we will cease to exist. So I want to ask you, as a person doing the hiring at a place like the Chronicle, how do you try to sort of bring in a diversity of viewpoints, but also sort of balance that with the need for institutional knowledge and people who have been around and watching?
Yeah, it's a really good question because diversity in the newsroom to me is one of my #1 priorities. Of the last 60 or so people that we have promoted or hired, all but 7 of them have been non-white, straight men. So, and it's something I'm super proud of because we can't do stories about, a mosque that's integrating unless Sarah Ravani could go in there and she speaks the language and can go in with women and do those stories. So, diversity is really important. But you're right, it takes a long time to know people here. The fact that with Gavin running for governor and likely going to win is a perfect example because we've seen him really grow up since we've started covering him as a supervisor and a mayor and lieutenant governor, and that just gives you different perspective on what he's going to be like as a governor, what he's done, what he hasn't done. Frankly, the mistakes he made as mayor that we're still living with today, I would argue the decision that he made to basically never again open a new emergency homeless shelter is why, at the time, that seemed like a good idea because there weren't very long wait lists, and now we have 1,000 people on the wait list because we haven't invested in that. So you can, I can tell you that because I have that institutional knowledge, and we can have a debate about what his priorities would be moving forward and we learned about that. So it is a balance because because the people who have that institutional knowledge are not often the new people that we want to bring into the news.
Yeah, there's I think this inherent balance between fresh eyes, because you do get to know people. I mean, we've known Gavin Newsom for 15 plus years. We have some professional, but there's a personal aspect that goes along that relationship. And actually, I just had a funny moment. I didn't pull up this week, but so on my show, we interview a newsmaker or somebody involved in politics every week. This week I'm excited we're getting a pollster in, so we'll talk about how messed up polls are, so definitely tune in. But Newsom came in. We've extended the invitation to John Cox and Gavin Newsom for months. We finally got Newsom in. We snapped a selfie, to promote it. put it up there. A few days later, John Cox retweeted it and attacked my colleague Scott Schaefer, and by extension me, basically saying Scott was going to moderate the debate between the two men, and how could it possibly be fair after you see a photo like this?
Which is just crazy, because this is the other thing that I kind of, I mean, it's crazy for a lot of it's crazy, but I do, we didn't talk about this, but I'm sure it makes you think twice about having a photo like that, because you meant to promote something, and he used it in advance of the debate to imply the debate wouldn't be fair. Now, it may not have been a fair debate because one of them prepared for it, and one of them didn't. So, you know, there's that. I mean, I think he was just like, it was a preemptive strike against what he knew was going to be an unmatched situation.
Well, and that was what was upsetting. Of course, like, you see that, and I was at a conference in Chicago, and I just tried to, like, turn off Twitter for the day because I just needed a break. And I got a text going, did you see that? Okay, you open it up. And so, of course, we both texted back very politely, because if there's one thing you learn as a journalist, it's like, if you engage in a sort of tit for tat, it does not work out well. And we both said, hey, you know, we've invited you on the show multiple times, we'd still love to have you, we look forward to it. And he wrote back maybe the next day and said, oh, we'll try to get that scheduled. But it didn't matter by that point. Like, the genie was out of the bottle. My entire replies were full of angry, Make America Great Again folks. I mean, who he intended this to go to. So, like, as someone who's running as a Republican in a state with, you know, where Democrats far outnumber them, he needs independent voters. He knows they're not going to see that and care, but he also knows it's going to whip up his base. So it's sort of like this win-win that we can't totally win.
Yeah, and what I was going to say about the mayor's race in particular is one of the things that I had this epiphany of how the public sees what we do is that, and I know it's like this for you at the Chronicle, but also in public radio and public media, like, we ask questions to get answers from people. And sometimes we ask very pointed questions to see how you're going to react as a politician, and whether we can, like, get a fiery response or something. But what social media and what cable news has done to journalism is basically made the content is the questions. Like, nobody asks a question on cable news to actually get an answer. They ask questions because that is the content they're looking to project. And it's so not how we view our jobs at all, but we're competing with this different, very accessible to people form of journalism that has just become screaming heads at each other. And again, I will throw Fox News in that, and I will throw CNN in that, and MSNBC. I'm embarrassed to call them colleagues a lot of the time, because they're just screaming questions at each other and don't really care about what the issues are. Did you see that CNN just released this thing called The Forecast? And it's basically data scraping of every race and doing the projections of who's going to win. And you all on election night watched that New York Times meter that was like, oh, Hillary's going to win. Oh, wait. And then throughout the night, it went like, oh, no, we have a new president. It's President Trump. Do you remember that meter thing? Well, it's basically that before every race in the country right
Ahead
now.
of time. Before anyone's
Ahead of
voted.
time. And I'm just like, it's like what we say to our kids. Like, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And I think that people throw us in with the media, this like thing as if we all like get along in the first place.
Or there's some convention.
Right, there's a convention where we all get together. And it's just, you know, I think the cable news has done, trying to say, legitimate journalists a huge disservice of this.
But I will say that since we both entered media, like, the landscape and expectation of where we sort of, the ethical territory we stake out has shifted to some extent. Like, there's an expectation that, I mean, when I started in journalism, it was very much like the inverse pyramid, right? You start with the most important information when you write a story, and, you know, you end up with the least so that the editor can kind of lop off the bottom very easily. Clearly an editor came up with the yeah. But there was also the sense that, like, equal comment was giving both sides equal space in their story. And I think there's two things I want to ask you about, and I'll just say them both and you can pick one. But one is this idea that like the more expert I got in the areas that I cover, the more I realized that that was a false narrative in itself. Because giving both sides equal time doesn't mean that they're both equally valid, right? There are things that we know are true or not true. So I feel very comfortable, even though I will never tell you how I'm going to vote, saying something like climate change is real and racism is bad. Like those are not, I'm not going to debate about that. I'm not going to give white supremacists the same amount of space in a story about something like that. But the other is that like, I think because the landscape has changed and there's so much noise out there, there's an expectation that folks like us do step up and offer at least more analysis than there used to be. And that can get construed as opinion. So on sort of both of those, I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I agree. I think, well, what people click on is things that, I mean, this is a proven fact. You are more likely to subscribe to the New York Times by clicking on an opinion article that you agree with and then subscribing. The reason that opinion, if you look at our homepage, is way up on the right side of the page, which is traditionally the lead position in any newspaper or website. The reason it's up there is because they have a business incentive to put up opinion pieces that will make you click, because that converts to the most amount of subscribers. It's just a fact. So if you did, I mean, does anybody remember doing that during the election? It's okay, you can admit it. It's still supporting important journalism. But I do think we've gotten away from explaining what the issues are, because it's not what people right now, everybody's so upset, the right, the left, the middle, everybody's upset. They just want to see things that will reassure them.
And validate their worldview.
And validate their opinions, but like nuanced policy discussions are not what people get excited about. So if you don't reward that kind of journalism, you won't get more of that kind of journalism. And I think, we've gotten to a point in this country where journalists have a really hard time, do you call a lie a lie? Like that whole navel-gazing debate, I'm so over it. We spent so much time over whether or not the Wall Street Journal should use the word lie that we could have used in much more productive ways. But it's important because looking back, we do the first draft of history. And I have seen pages of the San Francisco Chronicle that make me embarrassed to work there. Because at the time, it was perfectly appropriate to say Japs and babe, whatever. That was an okay thing to say on the front page that now would never be tolerated as it shouldn't. So we do, I think we have I wrestle a lot with when my son reads the historic pages that his mom produced or the websites or the stories, what will he see that, will he think, wow, she did a really great job of summarizing the times, or will he, wow, you let this go on? And it's really hard as a journalist, I think, to figure out where you are on that line. Because there is such a thing, even in the city, as intelligent conservative commentary. There just is. And if you don't have that, and if you don't prosecute your own ideas by seeing what the other side says, then how do you know what you think is totally 100% correct? Because it's on my Twitter profile, but every time I speak to a group, I say, I really believe that there is no such thing as a right to an uninformed opinion. And if you're not reading things that make you mad, that's what you have. So when people say, oh, I get the Chronicle, but I get so mad and you're so wrong, and how can you write this? I'm like, I did my job then. Because the news should make you mad, what's going on in the world should make you mad, and getting mad should make you think.
And subscribe.